Be seated. We have such wonderful lessons today, and the tying together of the story of Elijah passing on the mantle to Elisha, the two great miracle-working prophets of the Old Testament. It's in many ways a poignant story, but a really wonderful one and full of rich imagery. The same thing applies to the story of the Transfiguration. And so at the very least, as literary motifs, these are epiphanies. These are times when people see things that you just don't see on your way to Safeway on a normal day. They're extraordinary events, not ordinary events. Sometimes people get caught up in chasing the extraordinary in their spiritual lives and forget to realize that God made us to live the ordinary lives we have and rich ones we have in our time and in our country. But in these epiphanies, there are fantastical things, and especially in the one where Elijah is taken up. The whole point of the story, and maybe the point of both of the stories, is passing on what has been revealed in the epiphany. Having the epiphany is what Peter got caught up in. We've had this great, wonderful religious experience. Let's build buildings. Sounds really churchy, doesn't it? or let's build monuments to something that happened a long time ago. Jesus wasn't interested in that. And in the passing on, there has to be a taking on. So, Elijah and Elisha, or Elisha, sometimes pronounced to try to keep them separated when you're reading these, is given the opportunity to receive the spirit of Elijah. But you realize that Elijah couldn't give it to him. He said, "You've asked for a really hard thing." And the implication is, I can't give it to you. I can't give you a double measure of me to you to go live your life on. But if you're ready to take it on, if you're ready to take on the mantle of the voice of God in his time and place for Israel, you'll be able to see me go to the Father. You'll see me go to God. And then the image is great. Here goes here come the chariots and horses of fire, screaming. I mean, this is any Marvel comic can't keep up with this imagery. Can't do any better than the horses and the chariots of Israel flying through the sky on fire, and a whirlwind taking Elijah into the heavens. And so we see then the opposite movement on Transfiguration. Now there's a mountain, Mount Tabor in Israel. It's about in the middle of the country, and it's this weird little mountain that just sticks out in the middle of a plain. It just is there. There's no other mountains of any sort around it. But so it's been picked as the high mountain that Jesus took his disciples up on. That's as good a choice as any. There are churches that go back to the Byzantine era and even before that have been built on that site. But it is a slightly forested, it's got evergreen trees on it. It'd be a pretty good hike. They'd be huffing and puffing by the time they got to the top of the thing on foot. And then in this extraordinary vision, again, extraordinary imagery of Jesus You might wonder, why do we wear white robes? This is one of the sources of that notion, is Jesus' white robe being clothed in dazzling white as the representation of his glory. But sitting with him, consulting, just having a little powwow, whatever you want to say, is Moses and Elijah. Now, Moses was called a prophet and is called a prophet in Judaism. We think of him as the lawgiver, or the one who led the Israelites out of Egypt, out of bondage. But he's also called the greatest of all the prophets. And so and Elijah is number 2. Now later on for Christians, Isaiah becomes more important. But in the lived life of Israel, these 2 heroic figures who spoke for God, who talked with God, who did wonders beyond. They were wonders for them back then. Sometimes we think, oh, well, they were all superstitious. That was easy for them to believe. No, they were amazed. They knew, up, down, gravity. They knew that water flows down, and they know plants grew up. They were connected to the world in the same ways we are. They didn't understand it the same way, but a wonder is a wonder. A miracle is a miracle. A vision or an epiphany is an extraordinary event, no matter when it happens. And it then shows us in these 2 different stories, one, God's steadfast love. We think about the passing on of the prophetic mantle. God's steadfast love for Israel to continue to provide a voice. And then, when we reach this moment at the top of the high mountain, we find the one who's calling himself Son of Man consulting with the 2 greatest prophets of Israel and the lawgiver. And so the connection couldn't be more clear in Mark's gospel, that he's saying Jesus is in complete congruity and continuity with the 2 greatest prophets of Israel. And therefore, the line, "This is my beloved, listen to him." Now, when do we hear God address him that way before this?
Baptism.
At his baptism, right. This is my son, the one in whom I am well pleased, or my beloved in whom I'm well pleased. And so we see this language repeated, only this time, instead of it being about Jesus, it's about the disciples. And they're saying, okay, if you would listen to Moses and if you would listen to Elijah, then you better listen to Jesus. He's in continuity with the great prophets. So in these literary figures and extraordinary events, what gets connected? Heaven and earth. Again, this sense of God dipping down into the common ground of our lives. But when that happens, it's like something, it's like fireworks. It's something that is noisy and raging. It's a storm, the psalmist says. It's a blazing, consuming fire. These images of God are so active and powerful. And then this is the powerful God who comes and makes a moment so extraordinary that we remember it thousands of years later. Elijah, I guess we could probably put 2,500 years ago or more. Still, here I am talking about him. This extraordinary moment. So, when we have those on our own level, within our own lives, they become marking points. The Transfiguration becomes the marking point of the halfway of Jesus' ministry. After the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem. And the ministry moves from the northern Galilee part of Israel down to Jerusalem, the center of all religious and Jewish political life. So this pinnacle moment has that effect as well. And so I want you to take all these things I'm saying can be applied to our own spiritual experience. Every one of us has some story to tell of faith or of experience of the transcendent, some kind of moment. It's interesting in the collect, it said our problem are pride and shame. And these are what get resolved. We become people who are marked in special moments with the knowledge of God, or the experience of his love, or the relief of his forgiveness, or a moment of clarity where we know what to do. Gosh, I would pray for just more of those. Just the moments of clarity where I know what I'm doing is in God's will. Those markers, those extraordinary things, aren't where we live every day. We'd wear our adrenal glands out if we tried to live at the peak spiritual experience 24 hours a day. We're not built for that. But our memory can make them so vivid for us that when we forget, or when we're down, or when it doesn't seem like God is showing up where I need, then those have become reference points that I can go back to and say, I know that was real. I know God showed himself. I know God forgave me. I know that God showed me how to love or how to give. I know. These markers, these epiphanies, these showings that were God's showing particular to me. How deeply personal God's life is with the world. People with names. Now, unfortunately, this is all full of men's names, but women are in there too when we do the whole thing. That God comes to particular, individual, real live human beings who are not extraordinary compared to us. They're just chosen. And then they follow God's will and extraordinary things happen. I always used to get that wrong. I always used to think if I could be extraordinary, then extraordinary things would happen. But that's not how it happens at all. If I'll just be an ordinary, faithful, praying Christian, then extraordinary things will happen. And I don't need to take pride over it. And if something doesn't happen, I don't have to be ashamed. God's in charge of the outcomes. And the epiphanies are not the event. They're the lights along the way to God's will. So we end our Epiphany season today. And Wednesday we have our ashes. And next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Lent. And so as we make this transition, and perhaps things seem more somber or whatever, remember that what we've been set up for as we head for Easter, and as the disciples were set up for as they headed toward the Easter, is just be ready for extraordinary things to happen if you really want to be in love with God. You're really going to do that. And give yourself over, your trust, your love, your life, your will, your outcome, your future. If we can put all that in God's hands, as best we can, not perfectly, but best we can, God will carry us into his future. And we'll see angels ascending and descending a few weeks ago. We might see the fiery horses and chariots of Israel fly through the sky. We might just see somebody get well, or somebody be reconciled. And that's extraordinary enough for most days. Don't you think? You're extraordinary people, and I'm happy to be with you this morning.